Good morning, everybody, and welcome along. It is the morning of the 19th of August, 2025, and we are here today with a catch-up live stream that was originally scheduled, for Sunday, then I had to move it to Monday, and then due to an emergency decline and fall broadcast covering the Alaska summit and its aftermath, I had to move it again to today. But here we are with the promised episode. We're going to start off with a brief discussion on the question of multipolarity and class conflict, because I think this is something which needs to be understood properly. And then we'll go into the Q&A session, and we will take a look at who's in the chat and who's got questions. We've also got questions coming in on the email. So, be sure to send your questions either way through to me, and they will get addressed over the course of the next hour or so. So we will start off just by taking a quick look at the chat. So who have we got here so far? We have Working Prole Incorporated, Southwest Garbo, Edward coming to us from Latvia, I believe, who has a good couple of questions for us. We have Comrade Daniel. We have Monazi17. We have Bob Parr coming in from Australia. We have Yuri. We have Anthony in Prague. We have Melly. We have Jerry. Hello to you, comrade, down there in Hampshire. We have Luxy223. We have Gonzalo Cabrera from Madrid. We have Francois and Vera in the chat so far. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. Okay, so let's get into this. Just on the opening I wanted to do today was a brief one on the question of the fact that class war is a permanent condition. Now, how strongly that war is waged and the intensity of it is going to vary from time to time and from location to location. So in different countries at different times, depending upon the strength of the class forces and also any external threat that the country is under, the relative intensity of the class war will vary. But it is a permanent condition. Class war is a permanent condition. It is one that the ruling class is obliged to constantly wage upon the working class, and the working class is obliged to defend itself in whatever way it can. The assumption made by some, at least, that class struggle gets cancelled out completely in this current, shall we say, move towards the multipolar world. This is nonsense. This is something which is not serious, because even though let's take the example of Russia. Now, I criticized the website entitled "In Defense of Communism" recently, because principally I don't think they're defending communism anymore. I think they're screaming bankrupt and ancient slogans. But the reason why I did so was because, of course, they have put forward a point of view which is, as I have said, un-Marxist nonsense when it comes to Russia. So I'm just going to put this up on the screen here so you can see what I said and how it relates to the subject I'm talking about today. So there you go. You should be able to see that now, which is what I said, because they took the view that capitalist Russia is derived from the counter-revolution that destroyed the Soviet Union. Now, that's true. That's a real thing. There's no denying that. But from there, their point of view does not evolve. I think it's the guy Nikos Motas who wrote that, takes the view that it was a counter-revolutionary state 34 years ago. Well, let's say from 93. Let's say from Black October, or 32 years ago. And it remains exactly what it was, or its nature hasn't changed in 32 years. So my point to him was that that's a very un-Marxist point of view, because one of the kind of defining features of Marxism is Marx and Engels' great intellectual advancement, which is their understanding of dialectics. Now, nothing in the physical world, the natural world, nothing inside of us as human beings or outside of us remains the same. That's true of our own bodies, don't remain the same over time, no matter what some people do to desperately arrest the process. The world around us doesn't remain the same. Like this desk I'm sitting at isn't the same at the end of this broadcast as it was at the beginning. So you extend that also into the realm of the political and the economic. The Russian state that emerged after Black October, where Yeltsin got rid of the Supreme Soviet and imposed the current Russian constitution, which is a Bonapartist constitution, and was meant, as the Communist Party of the Russian Federation correctly points out, that it was meant to guarantee basically a Pinochet-type regime run by Yeltsin. And that was meant to reinforce that. However, nothing remains the same. So when it comes to state structures, when it comes to economic structures, it is the class war and also the struggle for national liberation, which changes things. And Russia, in the 1990s, almost became a complete neo-colony, particularly of the United States and Britain, with also the Germans and to a lesser extent the French involved as well. Other minor European powers playing a certain role, Dutch, Belgians, etc., but principally the US, Britain, and Germany. Now, that reached a point in 1998, and some of you watching this who maybe as the older generation will remember the crisis of 1998 in the Russian state, the collapse of the economy, and that created a situation where the Yeltsin regime became destabilized to the point where it had to make significant concessions just to survive, meaning that the communists had to be brought into an official role in government, and the process of essentially turning the country over wholesale to the US and the British imperialists was slowly brought to a close, starting in 1999 with the coalition government. Now, the effect of this was the establishment of a situation whereby the balance of forces inside the Russian Federation changed, and this is something which, of course, is not acknowledged by those who like Motas want to say that nothing's ever changed. So, under the government headed by Yevgeny Primakov, for instance, which was 98 to 99, they started to actually reverse some of the most egregious counter reforms of the Yeltsin-Gaidar period, and also it ushered in a new balance of forces in the state. And this is what ultimately creates Putin. Putin is brought in because he's a candidate initially who's acceptable to all the different factions inside the Russian power structure. Now, what does this mean? This means ultimately that the Putin leadership, under the influence of the organized working class as expressed via the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, under the influence of the national bourgeoisie, meaning those who have a direct interest in the development of the productive forces inside Russia itself. So that's it. In though that lot, whilst they share, an interest in maintaining private control over the means of production with the comprador bourgeoisie, their interests lie in development of industry inside Russia itself, even from a capitalist point of view. Whereas the comprador bourgeoisie, and this is true not just in Russia, but in every country which is compromised by imperialism and neocolonialism, their interests, where they derive their profits from, is linked directly to the imperialist powers. So if you look at the groups that were in charge in Russia in the 90s, their sources of income, their sources of profit, were often directly related to their ability to access capital from the imperialist countries and to actually access various things, including property, including businesses inside the imperialist countries. So their entire means of making profit was linked to their assistance in advancing the interests of imperialism inside Russia itself. People like Boris Berezovsky and others, for instance, in the 1990s, who ended up dead, hanged in his own shower. Very fitting end there. But the point about this is, and how this links to the question of class conflict, is that the class conflict that was going on inside Russia, including battles inside the ruling class itself, created a new balance of forces by the early 2000s. And this balance of forces has constantly adjusted ever since. Putin took over the Bonapartist constitution of the Russian Federation, and yes, continued to run a capitalist system there, albeit one that, as time went on, became ever more under the control of the central Russian state. So in restoring the writ of the Russian state to rule all of the gigantic territory of Russia, in eventually sorting out the organization of the Russian military, though not after a few false starts, it must be said, in securing control over key aspects of Russian economy, such as oil, gas, military production. If you look at all of these areas which Russia is doing well in now, it's built on a solid base of Soviet technological achievements. Point about all this is this new balance of forces created a new reaction. For every action, a reaction, and then a reaction to that reaction. So the action in Putin and his group seeking to stabilize things and to restore the basic elements of state functionality, even just capitalist state functionality of Russia, that, of course, immediately threatens the interests of the imperialists who wanted another Yeltsin figure to make sure that Russia remained totally under control. Now, remember a comment that Putin made to, it was Modi, at I think it was some sort of trade fair, must have been about a year ago now, where he observed to Modi that in the 1990s that the West was, particularly the US and the British, were pushing for the Russians to do away with all of their nuclear power plants on the grounds that they were dangerous. Now, of course, that wasn't the real reason, but a Russia without nuclear power is one that is, of course, much less energy independent, and therefore more likely to be subject to control by the West. And as Paul points out in the chat, the banking sector in Russia has actually been brought under the control of the state. There are still private banks, but one of the things that has been done by Nabulina, the director of the Russian Central Bank, is that a lot of banks were consolidated and eliminated. A lot of banks controlled by oligarchs and compradors, in actual fact, and consolidated under the broad direction and control of the Russian state. And again, that's something which the imperialists really did not like. As if we look back at how the imperialists have constructed their system of neo-colonial control, not just you want to control industry, you want to control how that industry develops by making sure, as was the case in Russia in the 90s and the early 2000s, that even the oil industry, for instance, the one that had been built up by the Soviet Union for decades, the machine tools needed to operate successful oil extraction operations and refining operations, a lot of those had to be bought from Britain, France, Germany, and the US, because the industries that produced the equipment and the parts of that equipment needed to run the oil and gas industries, those industries had disappeared in Russia in the 1990s. They've been closed down. They've been asset stripped. So this is all part of like the neo-colonial system, which is that you want to make sure that, yes, you might have to get resources from a country like Russia, but you want to make sure that the whole supply chain remains under your control, meaning that they can't get the oil out of the ground without key instruments, which you, as the imperialists, produce. It's why they started getting mad at Putin. It's not that Putin's an anti-capitalist or some kind of socialist. He's really not. He's been compelled down the route of greater state control, and actually slowly adopting things that the Communist Party of the Russian Federation has been demanding. Not something he ever wanted to do, but something he's been forced into. Because if he's serious about wanting the Russian state's control over certain things to remain or to be enhanced, I should say, then he has to essentially extend the power of the Russian state over so-called private industry. Now, by doing that, again, a new balance of forces in the international sphere was produced. And the imperialists started going absolutely apeshit, because suddenly they realized that what they thought they'd achieved, which was the complete subjugation of the Russian Federation under the management of the domestic compradors, well, that started going away from them. So for all Putin and Medvedev going to Berlin, going to Paris, going to London, going to New York, saying we want partnership, we want partnership, we want partnership, all the way through the 2000s, they were doing this up to 2008, and then again to 2012. They kept doing this, and the US and the British keep punching them in the bollocks, basically. So in terms of color revolutions, in terms of destabilization operations inside Russia itself, this is what they keep doing over and over again. It eventually reaches a point in 2014 where the hostility breaks out into the open with the Ukraine coup. The point about all of this is that no picture ever remains the same. Russia is compelled into a situation where that they are now confronting imperialism openly. Now, how does this relate back to the class conflict situation? It doesn't mean that class conflict in Russia doesn't exist in terms of the state of play of the Russian working class versus the Russian capitalist class. Very much is the case that the class conflict remains, and in fact, in some areas, intensifies. The point about it is that, first of all, prioritization has to be given to making sure that the nation remains independent of the domination of neocolonialism. It's not that the class conflict goes away, it's that the primary contradiction has to be identified and acted upon. And the primary contradiction in the case of facing the Russians right now is the actions of imperialism upon it. And also, in this time of war, certain things are revealed, such as even the national bourgeoisie, for all its trumpeting of Tsarism, orthodoxy, whatever. In actual fact, when it comes to confronting the West, the national bourgeoisie becomes very nervous and very weedy quite quickly and has to be pushed into doing things by the working class, as was the case for the entire war in the Donbass for 8 years. So class contradictions don't go away, even when faced with imperialist aggression. It's just that when faced with that, the priority has to be given to facing down the imperialists, and also to forcing the bourgeois government, in this case the government headed by Putin, to actually take the appropriate actions to win the struggle, to force the imperialists to back off, to defeat the imperialist proxies. And again, I would urge everybody to read the analysis of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation on this, because again, the winning of the war in Ukraine has also been, in part, a class struggle inside Russia itself. So the forcing of the government of the Russian Federation to take over Crimea partly was a strategic consideration with regard to the the fact that they didn't want the British and the Americans setting up shop in Crimea, which is what they did want. It's one of the reasons why they got so angry about the takeover, because they had British have had this mad idea of control over the Black Sea for a long time now, and they thought that they got it. It turned out not to be the case, but it was a domestic rebellion inside Crimea itself, and a mass defection of Ukrainian troops to Russia, which actually secured that. Just as it was a rebellion of the Eastern Ukrainian working class that actually started this war and slowly changed the balance of forces inside Russia itself towards the more towards a more proletarian stance, and towards the stance of those who favored freeing Russia from the bonds of U.S. influence in particular. And so the class struggle there, which is combined with a struggle for national liberation and a war of anti-fascist defense, fundamentally changed the balance of forces inside Russia itself, and has enhanced the strength of those forces, favoring strengthening the national struggle, and also with those forces which are, and by necessity, proletarian forces. So this is the way that there is a constant interaction in a nation like Russia between the struggles of the working class, which includes the struggle against the domestic bourgeoisie, including not just the compradors, but the national bourgeoisie. And that struggle reveals that it is only really the proletariat who can be as a social force, as a class force, which can be relied upon to push forward the national struggle in Russia in favor of liberation from the influence of the Anglo-American Empire. And that is part of the way in which the Russian state has been compelled down a course of change. It is the influence of the proletariat, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, and the proletariat specifically in what was once Eastern Ukraine, now Western Russia, compelling the Russian state to fundamentally change its positions. And therefore, to go back to the original tweet from In Defense of Communism, that's why their position makes absolutely no sense. Because what it says is this state that was created in 1993 will always be counter-revolutionary, will always be reactionary, and it's also imperialist. They can't back up their claim that it's imperialist, by the way, just assert it. That's what happens when your Marxism isn't based on analysis, isn't based on historical materialism. It's based on slogans which you just repeat endlessly, which is what the Trotskyites do. It's what the cartoonish Western Maoists do. It's what sectarians do. And it might get you a bit of traction online, but it doesn't actually mean that you're doing serious analysis. You're, again, just repeating dead words. Right. So to conclude this particular section, the national liberation struggle being waged in many parts of the world, we've focused on Russia, but also you could advance this further. So like to look at places like Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, etc. The national liberation struggle there to free themselves from French neocolonialism is something which was pushed forward by an alliance between like radical officer corps, radical officers who are from the nationalist tradition, or in the case of Burkina Faso, from the particular Sankarist socialist tradition, and others in the masses. So like the proletariat and the peasantry, who responded to people like Ibrahim Traore's call for the masses to mobilize for the revolution. But it is the role of the proletariat and the peasantry in a country like Burkina Faso to be the force that will push the process of national liberation forward, precisely because they are the force that, well, first of all, they are the proletariat in particular is the only truly revolutionary class. But also there are forces amongst the masses in these countries who are not connected to the dirty deals of the compradors and have only suffered from neo-colonial domination. And because their interests are pegged to the development of the country, the people like Traore are able to pull together a coalition of forces which have successfully liberated their nation thus far. So the role of the proletariat in pushing forward the national liberation struggle is absolutely crucial, and always has been, even as the proletariat is quite small in terms of being the key, what do we say, the most advanced class, the most revolutionary class. But even where the proletariat is quite small, leading going into coalition with other forces such as the peasantry and maybe elements of the petty bourgeoisie, but with the proletariat being the core of that, and it being proletarian ideology, which is the strongest form of national liberation. So let's get back into questions from the audience here. So let's go to Edward first. What would be your opinion that the tacit remnants of the post-1945 compromise in the imperialist countries provide a material basis for the delusions and retard class consciousness? People in the imperialist countries still enjoy higher wages and better infrastructure than largely elsewhere in the world, even though it is being step by step dismantled. Well, I think that what happened there is, well, largely as Edward says, basically what the 1945 compromise, particularly, well, Britain, France, West Germany, and Italy, of course, what those concessions were designed to do two things. First of all, and this would be the immediate concern of the US imperialists who funded a lot of this, was that you have to stop any transition to socialism. So that was the first aim, by make enough concessions to split the working class, to split up the movement of the masses, and to make sure that you isolated the communists and pushed elements of the working class towards different political organizations that were, many of which were anti-communist. So that's the first aim. Second aim is to retard, as Edward says, class consciousness, and to make it the case that the working class essentially got temporarily bought off. And so the revolutionary consciousness that existed there in many European countries, including Britain, in 1945, the urge towards some kind of socialism, albeit however poorly understood that might have been, that existed there for a while, that got derailed. That what happened next was that the working class basically retreated from that revolutionary understanding, or the beginnings of a revolutionary understanding, and started to see bourgeois parliamentarism as their path towards things, as a path towards further socialist advance. That has an effect that lasts a long time, as I'm discovering as I get older. That however disillusioned people are, however angry they are towards the politicians and the system, there is still an expectation amongst many in the working class that they just need to elect the right person. That they can just find the right combination of politicians. Now that's becoming rarer and rarer as time goes on, but the illusions sown, the illusions in parliamentarism, the illusions in capitalism, the illusion that you can have some kind of balance between a little bit of capitalism and a little bit of socialism, and that welfare capitalism or Keynesian social democracy is the best balance between the two. The illusion that can be brought back, that lasted a very long time. That's still there amongst the labor aristocracy in particular, and the trade union bureaucracy, and very these things which unfortunately is still powerful in Britain. So yes, it was designed to break up, to hurl back class consciousness, to divide and confuse the proletariat, and it lasted a long time. The fact that real material gains were made during that period, which haven't been completely destroyed yet, remains a problem. Now, I would just qualify this by saying one thing. There was a chance in Western Europe, there were chances to take things in another direction. If you look at the history of at least Britain, France, and Italy, you could also include Spain and Portugal as well. West Germany, slightly different question. Nordic countries, slightly different question. But certainly like Britain and France and Italy and Spain and Portugal, there were opportunities there for a revolutionary upsurge between about 67 and the early 1980s. By Britain, it all came to a crashing conclusion, or a crushing conclusion, so I say, in 1985 with the defeat of the National Union of Mine Workers. But there were serious struggles that were waged in Britain throughout the late 60s into the mid to late 70s, some of which could have gone in a very much a revolutionary direction. So, like the miners' strike of 72, that mobilized on a mass basis from below, the dock workers' strike that also took place in that time, the Upper Clyde shipbuilders' factory occupations, which took place not too far away from where I'm talking to you right now on the Clyde, various other struggles that were powered by, not by the trade union officialdom, but by militant workers pushing forward. There was very much a strong tradition of militant shop floor-based organizing in Britain in the late 1960s, early 1970s, which reacted to the increased pressure from the ruling class in the form of wage cuts and also in the form of factory closures, deindustrialization, etc. Now, those could have gone in a more revolutionary direction. In fact, don't believe me, believe the ruling class themselves, who were plotting various coups between like 67 and 75, 76. There was an awful lot of coup plotting by the ruling class, because in addition to the domestic class struggle, you also had the eruption of the struggle, the national question came back with great force in Ireland. So the ruling class in Britain were convinced that they needed a military government for a while to suppress the working class, suppress the Irish struggle, and they thought about bringing that grotesque old aristocratic sex offender, Lord Mountbatten, to head it. That was a serious proposition for a while. And so there was a chance of revolutionary upsurge, even in Britain, at that time. Now, what happened? Well, unfortunately, it is the role of the communist parties, plural, in not just Britain, but France and Italy, Spain and Portugal, which ultimately saved capitalism. Now, why did they save capitalism? To go back to Edward's question, because the communist parties in Western Europe and Britain and Southern Europe had all become essentially reformist. So they had all become, after the early 1950s, parliamentarist. They'd all become legalist. They'd become dogmatically reformist. Now, let's just revisit the question of tactics for a moment. Lenin always insisted that one had to be completely flexible when it comes to the question of tactics. So you might need to pursue a parliamentary line for a while, if that's the only thing that's possible. But again, the issue that Lenin would have taken with the changes in the European communist parties, and I see we've got Ash from Australia in the chat, so you can throw in the old Australian Communist Party as well into this, is that they became dogmatically attached to bourgeois parliamentarism after the social democratic reforms of the 40s and 50s. And even when the situation changed, now Lenin, Stalin, Mao all called for constant reassessment of the tactics that need to be applied depending upon the situation with regard to the class struggle. And the Communist Party stopped doing that. So in France, for instance, when you had not just the student insurrection in Paris and other places, but you also had like workers carrying out huge factory occupations all the way across France. Like de Gaulle had fled and was having to do deals with like General Jacques Massu, one of the former OAS leaders, to secure the services of the French army to launch a crackdown on the on the students and workers. Now, what rescued de Gaulle? It was the French Communist Party. The French Communist Party basically, now you can argue that this was under the direction of the Brezhnev group in Moscow, and certainly they would have had some influence. But fundamentally, this was a decision taken by the French leaders themselves. The Soviet Union couldn't force a decision on them. They were geographically distant from them. If the French Communist Party had decided that it was the right moment to push forward to bring France to socialism, in actual fact, even though there are a lot of reactionaries in France, the momentum was there for them to do so in 1968. The working class had expressed itself ready for revolutionary change. At least the advanced elements had done so. There were reports of mutinies in the French army and the French navy. So in this period, where there had been a good deal of social democratic reforms, it had actually led to a point where, because there had been a view that the working class in general seemed to have taken, that they were progressing towards some form of socialism. When it became clear that that wasn't the case, in fact, that the ruling class was starting to change the rules and class struggle was very much still a thing, there was an upsurge of struggle against the system in Britain, in France, in Italy. And what does the Communist Party do? The Communist Party runs away, surrenders, calls for the workers, uses all the influence and the prestige that the French Communist Party still had at that time to save French capitalism, to declare that the workers should just abide by peaceful parliamentary methods and to stop this upsurge against the French state. And what does that do? Ultimately, well, it puts the French Communist Party, the Italian Communist Party does the same thing. The situation is a little bit different, but there is still a broad upsurge in the class struggle that had revolutionary implications. French Communist Party, Italian Communist Party, Communist Party of Great Britain, what do they all do? They all move to reinforce reformism and save capitalism. They'd all become social democratic parties. They'd all become parties which were no longer the representatives of the militant working class, but of the dry and arid world of the trade union bureaucracy. And what does it do to them all? Well, within 20 years, 24 years, by the early 90s, the Italian Communist Party had been dissolved by its own leaders. By the early 90s, the French Communist Party was in a terminal decline, to the point now where it is an irrelevance. It's still around, but like it has very little influence anymore. Communist Party of Great Britain split 20 years later. It killed all of them stone dead. It removed the influence that the Communist parties had amongst the militant layers of the working class and aided the process of disintegration and demoralization of the proletariat. The decisions of the Communist parties of the West were a disaster for the working class, a complete disaster. Go over to Spain and Portugal. Portugal, where you had a revolution, Carnation Revolution. What does the Communist Party do there? Declare, ultimately, it pushes for bourgeois democracy. Same in Spain. So the decisions made by the Communist parties, and I'll conclude answering Edward's question on this point, reflect the incredibly damaging influence of reformism, because they all became reformists, and they all made this utterly un-Marxist assumption that the progress towards some form of socialism was going to be this long march through the institutions of bourgeois parliamentarism, which is a completely ridiculous, wholly un-Marxist position. aided, of course, by Soviet revisionism, it must be said. The revisionists in the Soviet Union boosted that point of view and used their still great prestige to reinforce leaderships like people like Enrico Berlinguer and others who put forward that point of view. But it's a disaster. And we can see it now. It's a complete and utter, not just a failure, but has sent us backwards by many, many years, that kind of influence. Okay. Edward says, a lot of workers in the West still live a petty bourgeois lifestyle and see themselves as individuals, consume bourgeois media culture, small vacations to Croatia, Greece, etc. So in Iceland. I would say that, like, it's not the great majority. Like, I grew up in a working class mill town in the northwest of England. And like my family had probably like a slightly better income than many. And so we did go to like European countries once a year for most years, even if it wasn't a particularly luxurious vacation. I mean, it was camping. But we did that. Most of the people I went to school with, though, all working class, like, didn't go abroad. They didn't go to other countries. If they went on holiday inside England. And that was true for most of them. So it's really a labor aristocracy thing, or it was for a long time, that regular foreign holidays were available to a certain section of the working class, by no means all of them. But given that section of the working class is the one often occupying the leadership positions, yes, you're right, it does breed a certain mentality. But the great bulk of the working class was never given those petty bourgeois illusions, never had the opportunity to have them. And it was always wildly overstated by the imperialists just how much influence, or just how many workers had joined the petty bourgeoisie. So I'd be careful about those assumptions. Now, if you'll excuse me for just one moment, I need to go and blow my nose, but I'll be right back. Right, here we go. So let's get on with this. Right. Most workers in the US live paycheck to paycheck, or as Marx put it, hand to mouth. Yep, that's true. Let's see. Hello to Anthony in Prague. Hello to Thomas Wolf from Oklahoma. Daniel asks, when would you say the last time Britain was fighting a defensive war or battle? I know many would say 1940, even though that was an exception at the time. Probably, it's probably 1940 was the last time that happened. I mean, one of the few times that happened. I mean, you could argue that the war with Napoleonic France got to the point where the British had to wage defensive battles, but they haven't had to wage one since 1940. They've not been under remote threat of invasion ever since then. As I've said many times, there was never any kind of serious Soviet attempt to actually invade Western Europe. That was never something that was a serious proposition. I mean, the other point about British social democracy was that the fact that there had been at least the appearance of a common national struggle in the very early 1940s, though, as Daniel's question implies, by the time the Nazis decided to go east, the threat to Britain very much retreated, because once the Nazis committed, I believe it was over 4.5 million men to the invasion of the Soviet Union, then there was no way that they could actually pull off an invasion of Britain, particularly because that would be tremendously difficult given the need for sea-based or airborne landings. Yes, 1940 would be the last time. Question: will a second revolution be necessary to restore communism in Russia? So asks Anthony. I would say that, well, first of all, at the moment, it's not clear, but it's not communism that they'd be restoring, because communism was never achieved in the Soviet Union. Nor even, I mean, they were on the path to socialism for a while, and it could be argued that they were still on that path, even with the crimes of revisionism. The Stalin period had advanced things quite a long way. But to answer your question, will a second revolution be necessary? Unclear at this stage. It will be interesting to see how the next sets of elections go. This is likely to be Putin's last term. And he has been there for a generation, and Russian society will be immeasurably different by the end of his final term. They will likely have won the war in Ukraine. The question over will a second revolution be necessary? Not necessarily. It could be the case that the KPRF could win the elections in the Duma. It could be the case that the KPRF come up with a convincing candidate for the outcome for the next presidential elections. Again, very much depends upon the state of play of the class struggle inside Russia itself. It will certainly, I mean, it's certainly the case that to actually go back on the path to socialism again, that the Russian bourgeoisie would need to be dispowered, or shall we say disempowered. And this would need to be done in terms of the taking control over any remaining industrial sectors that they have influence over, stopping them rinsing money out of the country, which they've continued to do, by the way, during the special military operation. For all that Putin has made noises against that, there's been no real action by the Russian state to stop it. The action to stop it all came from the US. US imperialists acted against that. So some kind of revolution will be necessary. What that will look like, of course, is unknown to us at this stage. We will get more of an idea once the war in Ukraine is concluded, and we can see how this changes the domestic class struggle in Russia, because you're going to have a large number of mostly men, but some women as well, who have been through the Russian armed forces, who have been to war, who have fought and in many cases shed blood for the country. And that's going to produce a different set of dynamics. And it's part of the reason why, fundamentally, Russian bourgeois really didn't want this kind of war. Wars like this tend to upend society. And it has significantly changed the view of the younger generations towards the Soviet past, and inspired a wave of regeneration of the reputation of Stalin, for instance, leading the Russian state into all kinds of weird contortions, ideological contortions. So the effects of the men coming back from the war, the effect of the final settlement in the war, the effect also of the fact that, as Communist Party of the Russian Federation does say, that for all the talk from the Russian state about honoring the heroes, etc. There's fundamental problems within Russian capitalism which can't be which the Russian state shows no sign of tackling, such as the Russians are suffering from their own problem with regard to house prices, problem of wages not keeping up with prices, etc. Similar problems to what we're suffering from here. Capitalism produces similar problems everywhere. So there's going to be a severe change, I think, brought about ultimately by the outcome of the Ukraine war. And I hope that that can be channeled in the direction of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, and that strengthens them and also pushes them in a more revolutionary direction. So we'll have to see. I suspect there will be larger scale changes coming in Russia, though we will have to keep our eyes open as to what those are. It's impossible to predict with a great accuracy at this stage. Mr. Nobody Freak says, how do you approach the working class people who reply that we can't afford to fight X? You have in short internalized the mainstream line that a better world isn't possible to fight for. Well, it's not easy. Now, I would say that this conception of being able to afford to do something is an interesting one, because that whole question reveals like a sort of internalization of bourgeois propaganda, because the idea of shortage, the idea of scarcity, is a capitalist invention. The means of production exist now. The technology level exists to make sure that everybody has access to the basic things that they need, that there needn't be anybody homeless, there needn't be anybody in the world going without food or adequate nutrition. All the level of technology needed for the provisioning of everybody's needs is there. The question is, like, why are people pessimistic about it? Because they've been told their entire lives that resources are scarce, resources are limited, we can't do this, we can't do that. And now one of the big things they're told is that, well, if we do that, it'll create devastating amounts of climate change. We can't do this for this reason. What all of this is inside the imperial core countries, it's essentially justifications for doing nothing other than carrying on in the same old parasitic fashion. That's essentially what's of course promoted by the bourgeoisie. So we have to try through our propaganda and agitation to show workers that decline and stagnation stagnation and decline, that would be the correct way of putting those terms, is not inevitable. The problems faced by the working class in our society can be resolved. It's just that they can't be resolved using the current economic system, and using the current ruling class has no real interest in resolving them. That's the thing that we have to get across to workers. It's not that the country is doomed to spiral downwards into collapse. It's not that nothing better can be done. It's that the current system is dedicated only to maintaining the rule of a parasitic tiny minority who just seek to essentially rinse money out of the system and don't care if it leads to internal collapse. And the problem is that because it's been so long since there was any kind of great collective struggle, any kind of like great boost in collective class consciousness and confidence for the working class, that this ingrained pessimism is there all the way across the West. This belief in doom, this belief that there is nothing better in coming down the road tomorrow. Now, there is an observation made by the great Soviet educationalist Makarenko that part of I don't have the exact quote to hand. I'm just going to try and find it whilst talking to you. So, if you will allow me a moment's improvisation, whilst I find it, yes. Makarenko once observed that the true stimulus of human life is the joy of tomorrow. That's a quote from him, meaning that the one of the great motivators of the human beings, one of the great things that gets us up in the morning, so to speak, inspires us, is the belief that there's going to be a better future for us and our children. And one of the things the bourgeoisie has done over the last 40 years or so is try and take away that belief in tomorrow. Try and take that away. Margaret Thatcher, there is no alternative. The Francis Fukuyama pronouncement that we'd reached the end of history, that nothing could ever be better than this, whilst things continually declined. And that is something which has had a devastating impact upon the working class, because if there is no better future, then what's the point of anything? This is something which is, of course, propagated by the bourgeoisie for certain reasons. They don't want a working class that is inspired. They want demoralization. They want hyper-alienation. It also creates problems for them, because like an alienated and depressed working class, it actually turns out not to be a productive working class. It's actually a working class that stops breeding. Look at South Korea. That's where you have the worst elements of neocolonialism and hyper-alienation. You have a population that literally starts to die out. So the problem is that we as communists have to counteract the ingrained pessimism which is placed there by the ruling class. Not an easy thing to do, but it can be done. We can give examples of the past and the present, of socialist countries doing things which actually create a better future for their population, and that we can do that here. There's no reason. The reason why it can't be done right now is because of private ownership of the means of production, and the fact that there is a tiny class of parasites who absorb all the wealth. And once we get rid of those parasites and institute a new system ruled by workers, then a better future can be ours. But it requires the giving up of illusions. It requires the giving up of the idea that you are some sort of petty bourgeois or bourgeois in waiting. It requires giving up on the illusion that consumerism is something which is good. The idea that buying products makes you free. The idea that, the more products you have available to you, the freer you are. Now, that is all a bunch of absolute crap, which comes from the consumer society period in post-World War II, and has infected the minds of many people, and has distorted our economies, which of course is made doubly worse by the fact that we are in this sort of advanced period of stagnation and decay. All of that is something that we need to address. Now, partly that can be done through agitation, but also the agitation only takes root when the class struggle intensifies, which it will in the coming years. Irish Partisan says the same thing happened here in Ireland, where the Workers' Party official Sinn Féin got taken over by a reformist clique, which destroyed it, with the clique going on to eventually join Labour. Yeah. Look, every time these fucking social democrats gain power, they immediately try and dilute class consciousness to elevate control of a bureaucratic clique and to eventually cut a deal with the ruling class. That's the way it always goes. Sophia says, elite groups, including landowners, industrialists, bureaucrats, military officials, politicians, wield significant power influence over decision-making processes in many countries. How do we fight that? Well, the only way of actually fighting that, really, is the mass mobilization of, particularly if you're in Western Europe, Britain, the United States, of the working class as a class. Like, you can't break the power of the landowners and the capitalists and the state bureaucrats by running for office in the American system. I mean, that might be part of the strategy that a tactic you adopt for a while, but you can't prevail over them trying to use their system. In the end, like the renewal of, I think you're talking from the United States, correct me if I'm wrong, the renewal of the American Revolution is only going to be able to be done, carried out by the proletariat. It's only going to have to be posed posed in the way of like the masses versus the tiny American ruling class and their immediate lackeys. And there's no reform that can change this American system. You have the most advanced version of monopoly capitalism anywhere in the world inside the United States right now. And so it has to be a question of making people aware of the fact that these monopolies not only exist, but control every aspect of American workers' lives. And also that the state is the political expression of the will of the monopoly ruling class. And I think many American workers will understand that quite instinctively. Even those who, vote for Trump or something, they will understand it very well, because a lot of them know on some level that, monopolization has taken place. They know that the politicians don't serve them. They know that the state is their enemy. Just a question of getting them to put it together, putting together the knowledge they already have with a theoretical framework which allows them to make sense of it. One of the things that bourgeois propaganda needs to do is to tap into people's decent instincts. So a lot of workers know very well that the state doesn't act for them, that the state is their enemy. Now, the more clever bourgeois propagandists can't really fight against that instinct that a lot of workers have. So what do? You tap into that instinct and mislead them. You send them down blind alleys. You give them an Alex Jones. You give them various other characters. You give them a David Icke. You give them people who will say, yes, you're right. You are being lied to and manipulated. But, it's the lizard people, it's, insert name of enemy. It's this religious minority. It's the people who are flooding the country with immigrants. It's this, it's that, it's the other. Anything to send people down a blind alley. But a lot of the reason why they have to do that, the reason why Alex Jones has a career, is precisely because a lot of American workers, on some level, do understand that the state is their enemy, that law enforcement is their enemy, that the federal agencies are their enemies, that the politicians don't represent them, that the corporations are their enemies. A lot of American workers do understand that, but they don't have the framework to put that all together into a correct conclusion yet. It is my hope that soon enough they will. But you find that a lot of workers do have elements of this knowledge already, because it's their actual experience. Their actual experience leads them to the point where they have to make certain, what would look like radical conclusions, just because of the experience of their own lives. The job of the Communist Party is to take what workers already know and can already see, Like, you don't need to tell an American worker that the healthcare system, or most American workers, that their healthcare system is shit. You don't have to tell them that they're getting ripped off and their wage packet is worth less every month now. You don't have to tell them that that life will be worse for their children than for them. A lot of them already know this. It's just getting them to put it together in a way that can actually develop them in the right way towards embracing Marxism-Leninism, and not going down the route of like all the distractions provided to them by the bourgeoisie. Comment on the Gang of Four. Interesting group, very flawed. And also, their trial was ultimately also not about them. They were just representatives chosen by the Chinese revisionists to bury, or so they hoped, the revolutionary legacy of the Chinese Revolution. It must also be said that the Gang of Four and the whole Cultural Revolutionary time did go down an ultra-left route. There was a lot of interesting things that happened in the Cultural Revolution, a lot of breakthroughs, but ultimately it went down an ultra-left binge, shall we say, and it was unable to defeat the revisionists, and ultimately they made an awful lot of mistakes, which weakened them and led to them being marginalized and, in the end, relatively easily defeated by Deng Xiaoping and others. Now, I mean, I'm going to do something on the Cultural Revolution at some stage soon when I get around to finishing the research. But the point is that that trial was about was so the revisionists in the PIA and in the CPC hoped, burying the revolutionary legacy of the Cultural Revolution. They didn't ultimately succeed because the CPC retained a revolutionary wing, even throughout like the 80s and the 90s into the 2000s. So ultimately that trial didn't work. They didn't bury the legacy of the revolutionary legacy of Mao Zedong. They didn't bury the revolutionary wing of the Chinese Party. It was weakened severely for a long time, but they remain there to this day. It's part of the balance of forces of the Xi Jinping leadership. Right, what else we got here? Paul says we could have a session on how to win workers to socialism in the West. Interesting. I'll add that to the list. It's disheartening how well the Western pro-Ukraine propaganda works on the Croatian populace here. Yeah, well, that shouldn't be a surprise in some respects, given that Croatia's been ruled by like pro-US, absolute stooge regimes for 30 plus years. So it shouldn't be a surprise necessarily that that's what happened. Ultimately, the only way that this is going to the pro-Western propaganda is going to fall apart is partly when the West is defeated in Ukraine, but also, again, like when the class and national questions return across what was once called Yugoslavia, when the Croatian working class realizes how badly the nation's been fucking stiffed by those people who called themselves nationalists 30 years ago, but who have just relentlessly destroyed the nation on behalf of a tiny parasitic clique who are in the direct service of US, British, and German imperialism. That realization, again, to go back to what the working class knows, a lot of workers will know that things have gotten really shit. It's just that they, due to the historic weakness of Marxism, Leninism in the former Yugoslavia, and by the way, that weakness goes back all the way to the criminal actions of the Tito clique, by the way. As I've always said about Tito, he's an interesting character, played a heroic role in the war against the fascist occupation of Yugoslavia, but ultimately adopted a revisionist line, ultimately made a hell of a lot of mistakes, including the taking of loans from the imperialists, and also adopted essentially, to go back to the social democratic point, a social democratic line weakened and destroyed ultimately the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, turned it into the League of Communists, and then that League of Communists became completely ideologically bankrupt and imploded. So you're dealing with, unfortunately, in Croatia, not just Croatia, but other countries in the former Yugoslavia too, a legacy of not just counter-revolution by reactionaries and fascists, but also from within the old Yugoslav system itself. Like, what ultimately happened after 1948 was the institution of a form of revisionism that was heavily dependent upon favorable terms from imperialism, and was also so then destroyed by imperialism when they no longer required them. So you have unfortunately, a lot to overcome in Croatia and other places, which I have complete faith will eventually be done. There's a lot of like heroic revolutionary legacies in the former Yugoslavia, where in the partisan war, for instance, where Tito did play a heroic role, and there were actually achievements in the Tito period as well, which need to be properly understood, and the disappearance of Yugoslavia. And here we get back to where we came in about the dialectic playing itself through. Tito's split from the Soviet Union in 1948 was an objectively reactionary, pro-imperialist move by the Tito clique, including the imprisoning and the murdering of many actual revolutionaries. By 1988, and certainly by the early 1990s, Yugoslavia is under siege by imperialism, and he's under siege from within, again, as a direct result of mistakes, fatal mistakes made by the Yugoslav leadership, including in the Tito period. But it was still the case that there were large progressive elements in Yugoslavia, including the unity of the Yugoslav peoples, which we, that is, communists in the West, should have been much better and much louder at defending. In terms of opposing the NATO wars in Yugoslavia, in terms of exposing the criminal and reactionary nature of people like Franjo Tudjman, people like Ali Izetbegovic, and others. And yes, that would have included defending the Central Yugoslav government headed by Milosevic at the time, standing up to the bourgeois propaganda that went around. Unfortunately, this wasn't done. It might not have made that much of a difference, but it needed to be done to like in the way that we can do now, in terms of if you saw my discussion with Kit Clarenberg yesterday on the Decline and Fall special, and the previous one where we were talking about the role that the American imperialists played in setting up the modern day Croatian states. But the fact what in one of the reasons why we have those discussions is that you have to go back to the Yugoslav era and the era of the breakup of Yugoslavia, and actually, if you examine everything that was done there, you can understand all of the ways that the imperialist powers have conducted their assaults on different countries over the last 30 years. Yugoslavia is the key to understanding all of this. I did see an interesting statistic from I forget which book it's from now, but I think it might be from the Parenti book on Yugoslavia. And actually, by 88 to 89, there were more people identifying themselves in terms of nationality as Yugoslav than at any other point between then and 1945. So in actual fact, the number of people who felt like they belonged to this nation called Yugoslavia rather than the constituent republic had grown and grown. There was no force left that could rid of Yugoslavia, and that's the real tragedy. Our Croat friend comes back to us and says, they do realize in some respects that they are fucked, to be frank, in accomplishment and respect the accomplishments of Tito's Yugoslavia, but through giving credit to pure logic and rehabilitation of fascists. So confused consciousness, to say the least. Hello to Chris Casseroles. Greetings to you in Murmansk, hero city of the Great Patriotic War. Interesting. Good to have you with us. Mo1917 says Stalin was a great thinker. Actually read his works. Mao didn't starve anyone. He lifted millions out of poverty. All of those things have been debunked thousands of times. Yes, well, we're going to be doing our own debunking on this channel, bit by bit and stage by stage, starting soon with a thorough examination of the Holodomor myth. So stay tuned for that one. Marg Bar Israel says, some people, such as my democratic socialist friend, whom I don't agree with, says that the revolutionary vanguard will become corrupt, so he believes in democratic socialism. How to counter? What became corrupt was essentially the social democratic influence. So what happened with the degeneration of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the League of Communists in Yugoslavia and other countries was that they became economistic. They became social democratic. They came to regard socialism as being purely and exclusively about improvement of the productive forces, which you do need, but if you separate that from the question of the power of the working class and the ability of the working class to exercise its dictatorship, the dictatorship of the proletariat, then what you end up with is social democracy and revisionism. So to go back to the concept of like corrupted leaders, there's nothing more corrupt than the leadership of the Western social democratic parties. You look at the leadership of the Labour Party. Look at the leadership of the French socialists, social democrats, Italian social democrats. Look at the role played by the communist parties once they became social democrats. There's nothing more corrupt and anti-working class than that. There's nothing which misleads the working class more than social democracy. So that is how I would counter it. Just look at the track record of the social democrats. It's appalling in terms of class collaborationism, in terms of their selling illusions to the working class. Over and over again, the same point comes up, which is that there is no one who corrupts and destroys the consciousness of the working class more than social democrats, especially social democrats in imperialist countries. And so your friend has it exactly backwards. Greetings to Nush82. Right. And Bertram Clement and Entropy Juggler, who says, regarding scarcity, it's true enough that inequity has been the modus operandi, but are you genuinely asserting that primary energy sources and material are infinitely inexhaustible? Depends which ones you're talking about. Nuclear power is certainly something which is the ultimate in renewable energy. There is apparently, according on which estimate you use, there's something like 1,000 years worth of coal under Britain. There are other sources of energy which are renewable. So I know there's different arguments about solar power, but certainly like the technological level is improving to the point where it can at least play a role in a national energy grid. Like other sources of power, such as hydroelectric power, so water-powered electricity generation. There's sources of energy and power, including my preference would be towards the mass development of new generations of nuclear power stations, which are inexhaustible. So, and also that the level of technology needed to continually refresh the soil, for instance. So in Britain, old perfidious Albion, we don't use most of the land for actually agricultural cultivation, and also some of the land that gets used because they do it as cheaply as possible does get exhausted. But there's no reason why land that is used for cultivation of crops has to actually get exhausted. You can engage in agricultural management methods, which keeps the land fresh and able to be used. You can do other stuff such as move agricultural production to new areas. You can develop. The technology is available to enable us to turn land that wasn't previously capable of growing crops into land that can grow crops. And then you can give some land essentially a rest to let it recover whilst you use other land. So there's all these different methods that can be used to get us out of the scarcity trap imposed upon us by the capitalist mode of production. The reason why these aren't taken by most countries, though they are a lot of this, there's been a lot of breakthroughs in terms of overcoming this in various different socialist countries. I mean, there's a lot of, dealing with the scarcity question was a very important thing. For instance, that the DPRK handle when they were quite genuinely under siege for a very long time. There's been great breakthroughs in reclaiming desert land for agricultural production in China, for instance. So the idea that, we're fucked, we can't do anything, everything's screwed. This is all a development of bourgeois propaganda over the last 30 years to make it feel as if we're trapped and can't go anywhere. That's all the rhetoric you ever get from the Western politicians. Like, we're fucked, you're trapped, there's nothing ever better than this. By the way, it's going to get worse, but there's nothing better, and don't you dare look elsewhere. We'll restrict your access to the internet if you try to look elsewhere. So we are trapped in this system at the moment because they have destroyed our ability to imagine anything better. And we have to find a way out of that. Do you have any advice on to activate cafe socialists into revolutionaries? Many of my friends were socialist aligned or either revisionist, which is a bit, which is okay in its mild form, which bugs me. Cafe socialism present and lack of wanting to be presentable when I close, etc. This is a very interesting question from our Croatian friend. There is, don't get me wrong, I love wearing a tracksuit, but I would argue that a good tracksuit is very presentable. But there is a factor here, which is that I think our Croatian friend's question points to, which is that communism, socialism is just seen by many as a means to express an alternative lifestyle, as a means for dropping out, as a means for essentially pursuing some sort of parasitic hippiedom. Whereas in actual fact, what socialism, or let's say being a communist is, it's something which should require a lot of self-discipline. We should require you shedding the negative habits that we all are encouraged to acquire by capitalist society. It should be something which demands that you get up early, study intensely, and always look for ways to engage with the class struggle. Workers' struggles, strikes, community campaigns, things like that. There is always some form of struggle to engage in and connect with the masses through. Sitting on your ass in a cafe, and don't get me wrong, these are mistakes I've made. When I was an anarchist, this is all basically we did. Sit around in a vegan cafe talking about a stateless society whilst doing absolutely nothing. It's something which, again, this capitalist society very much encourages us to do. The thing that we need to address is that we need to build an understanding of communism basically as the ultimate form of as a form of changing ourselves first before we can engage properly, or should we say changing ourselves alongside engaging in struggle. So we need to identify in communist parties the fact that people are going to come to us with all kinds of bad habits. Drinking, drug consumption, should we say, and this is unfortunately true, especially for men, negative attitudes towards women and sex, etc. Laziness, which it comes from, like laziness and demoralization come from this particular stage of capitalism, which again promises nothing and delivers less, and therefore basically causes people, and this is where the so-called anti-work communists make a big mistake, because labor under capitalism can come to mean just complete alienation and demoralization and atomization. Some people who call themselves communists now decide they're going to be anti-work, which is complete nonsense, because labor can be a great expression of human creativity and even liberation, but not under this system. So we need to strive towards a system where it can be. And so the mistake of the anti-work communists is to be undialectical in their approach, because laboring under capitalism now is profoundly unrewarding. They decide they're going to be anti-work, which is a ridiculous position. But yes, I'm sorry, I've forgotten your actual name. Your display name is NNNN. But I'm just going to refer to you as our Croatian friend. I hope that's okay. Who's coming back and says, the nice clothes doesn't mean wearing just suits. I mean, like hygienic, high-end and such. The types of clothes doesn't matter necessarily within reason. Yeah, you're right. It's just being basically well presented. Not looking as if you've just got up from like a 3-day fucking alcohol or drug bender, you know? It shows like presenting yourself decently, and you don't have to go around wearing a suit and tie, but just like being able to present yourself as though you can do basic things such as the maintenance of your appearance is something which actually inspires a degree of confidence in you. There is, again, one of the wretched legacies of the left in the 60s and 70s was that, like, being an unkempt weirdo became a source of pride. It became a source of, like, the more weird you were, the more revolutionary you were. Well, look where that's brought us. No, we should insist upon being decently turned out, on being having an element of self-discipline, being able to actually turn up for things, look at and not be stinking of booze the night before. Being able, essentially, and also not being a fucking boozer. Let's be clear about this. I'm not talking about having a drink every now and again. I'm talking about the fact that many people who get involved in communist groups in this country, Britain in particular, do it basically and adopt the culture of the trade union bureaucracy, which is riddled with alcoholism. So you can't be having people who in communist parties who are fucking alcoholics, who are fucking drug addicts, or who are fucking users of prostitutes, or people who fucking use pornography and stuff like that. All of these like wretched habits of this period of decaying imperialism need to be something that you give up to become a communist. People have to be told, no, you can't do this. If you value getting fucking hammered every night or several nights a week, or getting fucked up on narcotics, if you value that over everything else, then you can't be a communist right now. If you won't do some basic things to sort yourself out, then you're no value to us, basically. And people say, oh, I don't like giving up this, that, or the other. Well, then you're not ready to join a communist party. You're too busy indulging yourself. You're too busy burying your consciousness under a fucking layer of alcohol. If you can't give up like the vices that are promoted to us by capitalism, then you're not fit to become a communist. And I speak as somebody who has indulged in all of these things, in terms of alcohol, in terms of drugs. I've gone down that road. Again, it was a product of alienation and like despair to a degree. But when I severely cut down on the alcohol and completely gave up the narcotics, like I became a better communist as a result. problem with a lot of the Western communist parties is one of the problem is that they think that the only way that they can appeal to the younger generation is by promoting a drinking culture. I've observed this in many different organizations, including the trade unions. But we should be clear that we as communists should hold ourselves to a different, higher level of discipline, organization, and have the ability to identify the reason why capitalism promotes vices to us and to the whole working class, and to give a lot of these up. And giving these up and turning our back on them is a crucial part of becoming a communist. And if you don't like that, then it's probably not for you right now. You need to consider why alcohol, narcotics, prostitution, pornography, and all these other vices are promoted to us. They're promoted to us to weaken us. They're promoted to us to divert send our consciousness into dead ends, to tranquilize us, to anesthetize us against the damaging effects of capitalism. Paul says China has developed a safer thorium reactor. Yes, I saw that. Going through some more comments here. This is from Nush82. Is the German ruling class sensing a threat from increasing consciousness in Germany? Or is it precautionary step? Probably a precautionary step at this stage. I mean, I'm not completely up to speed with the way things are in Germany, but some of the more smart reactionaries in the German state can probably see the way things are going and can see that eventually there's going to be a revival of Marxism-Leninism in Germany on a mass basis. And so they need to take action to get out ahead of that and ban it, so they say. So they see it as, anyway. Marg Bar Israel says, why are there so many Israel and Ukro fans in the Chinese internet? How to counter them? I get triggered when I post stupid things in short videos. Should I even respond to them? No, don't bother. If you see, I mean, a lot of that is pro-Israel and pro-Ukraine stuff. A lot of it is bot farms. Like, I mean, the Israelis in particular employ the services of a shitload of people in India to run fake accounts for them. So it's not something that's worth bothering with that much, given how many of them are fake. Frida says, I've found a lot of young people who label themselves communists or otherwise socialists or some kind say that CPGBML is a conservative right-wing group. Why is this? Because CPGBML correctly rejected gender ideology and correctly rejected the idea that a man can become a woman just by wishing it was so, and correctly opposes prostitution and correctly opposes pornography. That's not conservative. That's actually a proper vision of like what a socialist society should be like, which is that all these things are removed from it. And like the problem with a lot of like younger people is that they've been sold a really terrible idea of what revolution means. They've been sold the idea that it means essentially like being pro-porn or pro-prostitution or pro-drugs, which it's none of those things. But they've been sold that. The idea, this idea by like all of these state-sponsored fucking state-approved socialists, like the Verso group and people like that. And so they've got this dumb idea in their heads. But, you know, the time will turn, and those of us who have taken the correct approach on these things will be proven right. It's often the case that you have to maintain a correct position, even when like significant numbers of like the working class are running in another direction. But you need to maintain the position because eventually history will prove us correct. Okay, our Croatian friend is called Nikolai. Well, hello, Nikolai. Views on Fur in his books generally, very useful information. I've said it before, like, he's done some very useful and interesting research. I mean, it fits alongside things like the books by Lazardo and others. I think it's the Khrushchev Lied is certainly compulsory reading for any Marxist-Leninist. And I think it's his argument. His argument is an interesting one because if you read his political analysis, he never claims that everything in the Stalin period was perfect. He never claims that there wasn't a titanic struggle going on there, and he specifically points out that I think he's largely correct also as in his assessment of the origins of revisionism actually going back into the 1930s or even the 1920s in terms of where revisionism came from. What he points out in all of his works is that the anti-Stalin paradigm of history requires no evidence when it's presented. And like the useful thing he does is trace, first of all, in Khrushchev Lied, just pointing out how many lies Khrushchev told and how many wild exaggerations he came up with and what the real purpose of it was. The real purpose of the secret speech in 1956 is the same purpose as the trial of the Gang of Four. The real purpose of it was to bury the revolutionary wing of the CPSU. That was its purpose, or to at least severely marginalize them, and by destroying the reputation of Stalin. That was what it was intended to do. Ultimately, it didn't quite succeed, though it did do an awful lot of damage, which was never able to be undone, even though there were opportunities in the Soviet Union to undo it. But there was the power of the revisionist group was too great in the end, and the power of the working class had diminished, unfortunately, in terms of class consciousness. The potential power of the Soviet working class was gigantic, and they could have overturned the revisionist clique had they been more achieved a slightly higher level of class consciousness and organization. But again, the revisionist clique promoted things like alcoholism and consumerism to make sure that the Soviet working class remained distracted and remained unable to properly claim its place, and also introduced all kinds of ideological confusion. That was the purpose of all of this. Yes, as Nush82 says, Grover points out that by late 30s, Stalin was ideologically and politically isolated in the Central Committee. Yes, the war postponed the sort of the rise of the revisionist group, but in centralized power around Stalin and others in the around the Central Committee. But ultimately, it also saw a lot of like the most advanced workers die, and led to increasing isolation of the revolutionaries, including Stalin, as a small minority on the Central Committee, which is why Khrushchev was able to do what he did, because he already had a majority on the Central Committee that wanted to go in that direction. Stalin, Molotov, Kaganovich, and a few others were opposed to this, but they were pushed out of the way. Okay. Can you briefly explain the relationship between drug distribution and the capitalist state? On the one hand, police and laws try to catch small dealers, but you can always get drugs in capitalism. The relationship between the British state and drug dealing is very extensive, as is the American state. We're going to be doing pretty soon, I hope, a special on this in the Decline and Fall show. One of the things you've got to realize is that certainly the American state machine, inheriting this from the British, runs one of the most extensive drug dealing operations in the world, arguably the most extensive. And a lot of its so-called special forces, the Delta Force, etc., are essentially a drug dealing, weapons trafficking, and people trafficking organized crime group. That's the thesis put forward by the writer, journalist Seth Harp. It also relates to the so-called cartels in Mexico. The state is one of the American state is one of the biggest drug dealing operations in the world. The purpose of the drug war, one of its purposes, again, like Nixon was motivated by various different factors, but one of its purposes was using drug consumption, which was again promoted by the bourgeoisie, to target the political opponents of the Nixon administration and the wider ruling class. That was admitted to by John Ehrlichman many years later, just before his death. So it's an interesting question. I think it will take a lot longer than I have now to go into it. But it is a class thing as well. The cops lock up like working class people and lumpens who deal in drugs, but the biggest drug dealers are, of course, the state institutions themselves. More on this in a future episode, because I think we can do a lot to go through that. It's a very, very, very useful to illustrate what's going on in late capitalism. Okay. Now, I'm going to have to draw things to a close because I have to go and do other work for today. I see that if there's any questions I've not answered, there might be a few in the chat. Do hold them for next time, and we will get into them, or email them to me at the address listed below, and I'll pick them up then. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in on this earlier morning stream. Be sure to like this stream. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, etc., etc. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Couldn't do the show without that support. I'll be back with you again tomorrow. But until then, thank you. And here's your music and visual outro.